My name is Patrick Wentz, and I'm going to give a presentation today on the Philippines Campaign from 1941 to 1942. So, a little bit about me. My name is Patrick Wentz. I have a BA in History from Slippery Rock University, and I also taught United States military history from 2002 to 2005 at Niagara University. I've been always intensely interested in the Philippines campaign. My grandfather, Klotz, fought there in 1944 and 1945 as a Navy Seabee, and I guess that's exactly how I got interested in it. Because so few documents survived this campaign, it makes studying the campaign extremely challenging. All post-war information was gathered years after the events, and the participants have been up close and personal in the battles, so it's a bit like studying an elephant through a straw at about 10 feet. You get little pieces of the puzzle all over the place, but it makes for a pretty good story once you start reading through it and studying it. So a little bit about the agenda here. I'm going to give a brief history of the Philippines, cover the primary sources, the Philippine Army preparation and why it failed, belligerents, both the U.S., Philippines, and on the opposite side were, of course, the Japanese. The decisive air attacks on 8 and 10 December. Why the U.S. Navy departed. All the stuff that was going on from 8 to 22 December, the time the Japanese originally attacked, until the main invasion started. I'll cover the land campaign. I'll cover the Bataan campaign very quickly. I'll cover what was going on Corregidor and why it was so important. I'll cover, of course, the fall of Corregidor and the immediate effects afterwards. So, a little bit about the Philippines. I'm not going to go all the way back to when Jesus Christ was a corporal, but I think I'll go a little bit farther back before that. So, Philippines, of course, is an archipelago made up of 7,000 islands. It's approximately 1,000 miles from north to south and 600 miles from east to west. 65% of the population lives on the two main islands of Luzon up here in the north and Mindanao here in the south. Here's a couple of different shots here. This is of the Philippine Scouts, who are, of course, Filipinos serving in the United States Army. Here's some of the ethnic Muslims living here in Mindanao. And here's a little girl whose ancestors would have moved to the Philippines about 50,000 years ago, also known as an Australasian. Kind of interesting that this little girl's descendants would live next to these people for all that time, and the two groups never really combined. So all in all, there's 184 ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines, and they speak over 120 languages and dialects. At this time, most of the natives lived through subsistence farming. So a quick history of the Philippines here. 1656, the Spanish arrive, and they dominate the Philippines for the next 200 and something years. In 1898, of course, the U.S. shows up and we beat the Spanish, and we do not turn the Philippines over to the Filipinos. We are very interested in Manila Harbor up here on Luzon, which is one of the best harbors in the Pacific. And this is interesting because we need to get to China for trade, and we want to use that harbor for a coaling station and also a place to put a Far East fleet. In 1899, a revolution starts, uprising starts against the Americans in the Philippines, mostly led by the mestizos, which are a combination of the native Filipinos and the Spanish who lived in and around the major population areas. The mestizos thought that they were just going to take over after we beat the Spanish, but they did not. We have a great time defeating the mestizos or the other belligerents. So in 1899, we formed the first company of scouts. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. The Macabebes were a surrounding tribe or surrounding ethnic group up here, part of Leyte, part of Luzon, and they did not get along with the mestizos, who were the upper class ruling class. So by 1901, we have 12,000 of these 12,000 members of this group, forming the first Philippine Scouts, and from them we form a constable force of about 12,000 men. So the first insurrection lasts from 1899 to 1902, and pretty soon after that, well, during that time, of course, the Moro Rebellion starts. So her relative starts fighting down here in Mindanao, and we have to send scouts down there along with U.S. Army soldiers down there to put this rebellion down. And so we have these Tibaing joint rebellions going on for quite a long time, all the way up to 1911 is when the Moro Rebellion was put down, and the Philippine insurrection up here in Luzon had ended by 1902. So the four main books I used for putting this presentation together are the Philippines Armies, 1935 to 1944 by Ricardo Troja Jose, who taught at San Thomas University, which became famous as a POW camp for internees during World War II. General Wainwright's story, of course. The Fall of Philippines was, of course, an Army Green Book, which was written following World War II. And then for some of the overall strategic stuff that was going on during this time frame, the Pacific War, 1941 to 1945, by John Costello. So a little bit more about the history. First of all, why did the Japanese hate the Americans, and why were they interested in getting the Philippines? In 1853, Matthew Perry and 4 warships opened trade with Japan by force, and the Japanese never forgot this, and they considered it a huge slight. Following the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the U.S. helped put together a treaty. It's known as the Portsmouth Treaty, in which case the Japanese got no war indemnities from the Russians, and the Japanese were furious about this. They had hoped for a big payout from the Russians after following the war, and that did not happen. In 1922, what was, of course, the Washington Naval Treaty. Japanese, once again, felt slighted because they got a much smaller navy. than the British or the Americans. And in 1931, a fellow named Herbert Yardley published a book called The American Black Chamber. It was about how we were spying on all the people at the Naval Washington Naval Treaty, and the Japanese were very upset about this too. So, as we all know, Japan at this time, in the late 30s, was in a war with China. In order to try to stop it, we terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan so that there's no more travel between the two countries, open travel between the two countries for Japanese to move here. In 1940, we had the Export Control Act, which focused on quite a few of the resources we were trading with Japan. And in 1941, July 26, U.S. freezes all Japanese assets, and 1 August, we freeze oil and gas shipments to Japan. So Japan knew that they had a very short time. They had basically run out of oil and gas if they were going to have any kind of war within a year at full use, or a little bit after that at a restricted use. So they decided to, of course, have the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor and drag the United States into World War II. So let's talk about Lewis Morton's book here. That's probably the most informative of the books. It was written in the late 1940s. So some of the official records that he tried to use was the official G2 and G3 records, which had come out of the Philippines and were shipped to Australia in April of 1942. All these records, the Navy confirmed shipping them to Australia, and they made it all the way to Australia, but they were somehow lost by General Sutherland, who was General MacArthur's chief of staff. Why he did not protect these is a dubious question. I think most historians agree he was probably trying to save his and his boss's egos, and by not having to explain to the world later on how this whole entire campaign was a foul-up. In May of 1942, personal records made it to Washington, so at least we know which people had served in the Philippines at this time. In 1946 is the Wainwright Report, which was from Memory and Journals. They, of course, had the war plans that were developed before the war, so at least we knew what war plans had been planned. In 1946, there was a joint committee that reviewed all the Pearl Harbor documents. And there were also, and they interviewed General Sutherland again for this joint committee. There were many individual reports written after the war. One of them was by Colonel Samuel Howard, who was, of course, the 4th Marine Regiment commander on Corregidor during the war. There are, of course, many unofficial records. Many soldiers and officers wrote unofficial journals in their time in captivity from 42 to 45. Some of these guys actually wrote regimental and higher records while they're captive. The author, Lewis Morton, when he was researching, sent out hundreds of letters to known survivors of the Philippines campaign, and he got outstanding input from just about every regiment and division and higher. Very few did not write anything. A few exceptions were General King, who ultimately surrendered Bataan. He refused to provide any input, and also the 74th Infantry Division commander, the Philippines Army, refused to provide any input either. There was also widows of many of the officers and enlisted men also provided letters that they had received from their husbands prior to the fall of the Philippines. There was also interviews with close to 100 different survivors of the Bataan and Corregidor campaign, and probably the best source of records were from schoolhouse student reports. So many of the officers who remained in the Army and the respective or other respective services after the war went on to other schooling after the war, and they of course had to write something about what they did during World War II as part of their schooling, and they wrote of course about their time in the captivity and fighting in the Philippines campaign. So these were excellent records. Outside of this, there was Japanese records following the end of the war. The G2 of the Far East Command of Japan basically interviewed everybody who was associated with the Philippines campaign. These were of various quality because they were very vague on decisions by the Japanese Army and who gave commands. Once again, people were trying to cover their tracks. The Allied translator and interpreter sections captured documents, and as I said to begin, interrogated all the officers, Japanese officers who were involved in the planning and capture of the Philippines, and of course all the records that came out of the Lieutenant General Homa trial. The maps that survived from this campaign, the Japanese had good maps, but a lot of the men who had served there drew hand-drawn maps. Some of the published works he also used were the Dai's story, which was about from a U.S. airman who escaped the Philippines in 1943. Of course, General Wainwright's story. He used that. Bataan Uncensored, which was written by Colonel Miller. Various arms journals wrote about their time in the Philippines. Quezon's book, The Good Fight. The Brereton Diaries. Probably the best books that were also written at the same time as this that covered the Philippine campaigns were other green books. Of course, the official campaign history of the Philippines, and then the medical corps wrote extensively about the Philippines in their book about the Philippines, about the Pacific in World War II, but they completely whitewashed the medical disaster that was happening on the Corregidor and Bataan. And of course, the Army Logistics also wrote about the Philippines campaign. Today, if you're interested in more knowledge about the Philippines campaign, you can go to the Library of Congress, to the Veterans History Projects, where they have many interviews about the people who had served in the Philippines campaign. You can go to corregidor.org, which talks about who was written by Paul Whitman, who was a journalist who wrote extensively um, about the cryptology that was going on Corregidor during the war prior to the Japanese invasion. So quickly, the Philippine Army preparation for war. 1934, Senator Quezon meets with the Chief of Staff of the Army, MacArthur, and asks him to take over the Philippine Army when the Philippines became its own commonwealth in 1936. And he would be the first, Quezon, of course, would be the first president, and MacArthur would be the head of would be his military advisor. Of course, in 1935, Quezon is elected. In 1936, the Army and the reserves, active Army, and the reserves of the Philippines begin to grow. In 1936, the regular strength had 7,467 people, reserve strength of 753. I forgot to say that MacArthur got to take some very talented young officers with him. Major Ord, who is, of course, related to General Ord, and Major Eisenhower, who became head of chief, later president of the United States. Following the war, were two of the officers he got to take with him to the Philippines to help him start up the Philippines Army. By 1941, the Army strength was down to a little bit over 4,000. This is because the Philippines constabulary continue to need officers and men, but the reserve strength was up to 120,000. By December 1941, the reserves had been called up for 3 months, and they were not doing very well because they're short of supplies, manpower, training, and officers. One of the biggest problems I'll talk about very briefly is Quezon never incites the passions of his people during the war. It's never an all-out war. He seems to have wanted to protect his people, so he let the military do the fighting, and he never tried to inspire the average person to take up arms and actively fight against the Japanese. Because the Philippine Army was so badly equipped, it was equipped mostly with U.S. M1917 rifles, very few machine guns, very limited artillery, almost zero communications equipment. It could be called, in fact, a U.S. Civil War Army with slightly more modern equipment. The communications problems and language problems that the Union had during the Civil War were only exacerbated in this war because of all the 120 different languages that were being spoken in the Philippine armies compared to the 5 or 6 major languages that were being spoken in the Union Army during the war. So really quickly, over here on the right side, you can see a nice map of the Philippines. The Philippines was divided up into 10 different military districts. In the very north, the first district, the 11th Division, was formed. Just south of that, the 21st Division was formed. And just south of that, the 31st Division was formed in 1941. All of these divisions would be called the North Luzon Force during this campaign. South of those, you have the 41st and the 51st divisions were formed in the 4th and 5th military districts, and these would be called the South Luzon Force. Way to the south here are the 71st and 91st divisions. Each one of these divisions from the 7th and 9th military districts would send 2 regiments north to fight in the Luzon because of its importance, and they would uh, this would be called the Reserve Force. The 68th and 81st this, divisions would, of course, fight down on Mindanao, initially with 2 regiments each. Their 3rd regiments from the 61st and 81st would later be sent over to Mindanao and form the 101st Division with just 2 divisions. And the 102nd Division, my bad, the 101st was formed from the 10th Military District with 3 regiments. It was the 102nd that was filled up with the 3rd regiments from the 61st and 81st to start the 102nd regiments. The 102nd Division. So here's some of the stuff that was going on in the Philippines. So why did MacArthur at this time? So why did MacArthur want to go over and take over as the head of the chief advisor to the President Quezon in the Philippines? Well, MacArthur's ultimate goal, as we all know, was to eventually become president of the United States. He thought once he could get into the Philippines, eventually he would be the Governor General, which would be a stepping stone, much like Governor General at previous Taft had become president of the United States. But so he insisted that he be dubbed a field marshal. So Quezon wants to have a universal style conscription. So basically all 21-year-olds from any year group would have to serve in the military. This would, of course, lead to a humongously big army. However, he had a very limited budget of $5 million a year, which equated to 10 million Philippine pesos a year. He did not want any former National Guardsmen from the Philippines National Guard in it. No ROTC cadets, no Philippine scouts. Start out fresh in the military, with a fresh military, to keep corruption down. He found out he had quite a few friends in the United States, most of these being former Filipinos. And so the first airplanes bought for the Philippine Air Force were bought by American Filipinos. His first officers came from reserve officers attached to the Philippines Division, and also from Filipinos who were officers in the Philippine Scouts. These were only a handful of officers, probably no more than 50. Eisenhower, when he gets there, or actually before he gets there, and Ord before he gets there, does not think that you can build a satisfactory, huge conscripted army with just $5 million, 10 million pesos a year. So he immediately starts butting heads with MacArthur, but MacArthur tells him to do it, and later on, MacArthur calls Eisenhower the best clerk I ever had. Not very nice, but probably true. So, to thicken the plot a little bit, in 1936, Japan opts out of the Washington Naval Treaty. 74 training camps were set up all through the Philippines. So basically, every military district gets about 7. And they were manned by Philippine constables and Philippine Army cadres. And all these camps would conscript indoctrinees from their local areas, and these people took 5.5 to 11 months of classes in the military. So it wasn't like an American basic training followed by advanced training. Now this is more like a little bit of Army training with everything else that'd be going on in a civilian construction corps camp, which were very popular at this time. So these people were doing a little bit of work outside the camps. They were learning new farming techniques. Anybody who couldn't read or write was being educated there. So these weren't really military camps as they were more glorified civilian conservation corps camps. But that's what they decided to use to train their military, and did not have very good results. Also, this time they started training reserve officers at two different schools: the Reserve Officer Service Schools and the Reserves Officers Training Schools. They found out that these short schools weren't working very well, so they had eventually started accepting ROTC cadets, and some of these people would go on to get additional military training with the Philippine Division in up in Luzon. All the non-commissioned officers were trained by the Philippine constables, which probably wasn't a very good idea because the constables, of course, are a police force and not a military force. 1936, the only military equipment that they were able to acquire for the United States was 100,000 rifles. High Commissioner Murphy, who was who was the Governor General of the Philippines at this time, was a pacifist, and he did not want a very highly trained, highly equipped Philippines Army. So he made sure that any attempt to get additional supplies or any kind of equipment for the Philippines Army did not happen. So the only thing they were able to get were these rifles. Any deals or agreements that MacArthur or Eisenhower or Ord thought that they had with the War Department before they left fell apart when they got to the Philippines. So it was not a very good start for the Philippines Army in 1936. Academy grounds for the new Philippines Army Academy were selected in 1936. In 1937, an additional 40,000 trainees are conscripted. In 1938, 34,000 men were conscripted into the Army. And in 1938, MacArthur returns to the United States to try to get more weapons. This is eventually met in 1939 when more artillery was shipped to the Philippines, but it was not placed under the Philippines Army. It was placed under the Philippines Division serving there. In 1939, the first mobilization occurs for the reserves, 24,000 men, and it is a complete and utter disaster. The 24,000 men who were mobilized, who were trained in years prior and mobilized for this event, did not do well. They did not seem to remember very much at all of any of their training. Their officers couldn't officer very much, and their NCOs couldn't NCO very much. And Quezon is furious. He calls MacArthur out on the mat, and MacArthur admits that the plan is not working, and Quezon threatens to fire him, but Quezon does not want to fire him because then he would lose face in the public eye. So MacArthur keeps his job, but him and Quezon's relationship is strained from then on. Eisenhower in 1939 grows tired of working for MacArthur, of course, because who wouldn't? And he goes home in 1939. Quezon begs him to stay, offers him a job as the chief of police of the new Quezon City being built in Luzon as a suburb of Manila. But MacArthur goes home. Not MacArthur. Eisenhower goes home, of course, has a great career. So even though the mobilization was a failure in 1939, 30,000 more conscripts are brought in 1939, and trained. 1939, Kazan, after the mobilization, goes to Japan to visit the Japanese government, find out what their intentions are for the Philippines. Japanese find him hysterical, not like he's funny, but hysterical like he's crazy. They think the man is unhinged. Why do we be coming here to ask if we'd be attacking him, their plans for the Philippines, etc. So they give Kazan, the runaround, said, oh no, we have no intention ever to invade the Philippines, blah, blah, blah. And he comes home thinking that maybe he was wrong and maybe Japan has no designs on the Philippines. Wrong there. 1940, Vietnam is occupied by the Philippines. But even though a country right next to his is being occupied, Vietnam is occupied by the Japanese, but Kazan does not take this as a rallying cry for his people to build a better army. He actually has massive budget cuts, and that year only 20,000 new trainees are trained. In 1941, beginning 1941, they passed their smallest budget for the Philippines Army ever. And 1941, in May, all U.S. service members' families are sent home because we fear a Japanese invasion of the Philippines. In June, the U.S. military mines both Subic and Manila Bay. That's in June. In July, MacArthur is activated again as the head of the U.S. Army in the Philippines. And August, he starts mobilizing the Philippines Army. The first 8 battalions to be organized, of course, are the engineer battalions, because they needed the engineer battalions to build camps. So that's exactly what they did. In order to pay for all this, Roosevelt sends over $10 million to help with the cost of the mobilization. In September, an additional 1,000 officers and 23,000 men were brought in. In November, so this is basically the 1st regiment of each division, Philippine division. In November, the 2nd regiment, and then the 3rd regiment of each Philippine Army division are brought up. So by the end of November, pretty much each division is getting close to full strength. By December, all of the divisions move out of their barracks and to wherever they needed to be assigned to stop a potential Japanese invasion. So by December 8th, there was 103,000 men in the Philippines Army. Of course, it wasn't a very well-trained army. They didn't have a lot of equipment. You could say that the enlisted men were enlisted barracks soldiers. They knew how to march, and that was pretty much about it. They had police-trained NCOs, and they had schoolhouse-trained officers. So it was not a good army. So the biggest problem is they had very little senior leadership, because, of course, it takes 10 years to grow a major from scratch. Well, it takes about 6 years to grow a major from scratch. It takes about 10 years to grow a lieutenant colonel from scratch. It takes about 14 to 16 years to grow a full colonel from scratch. So basically they had, at the very best, senior captains who were trained in the Philippines Army and not much else. And they only had about 20% of the artillery that they needed. There was about 150 guns in the Philippine Army for artillery. Most of these were old 2.95 howitzers, and French 75 millimeter guns from World War One. These are, of course, the American-built guns that shot French 75 millimeter rounds. So let's talk about the belligerents a little bit. By the time the Japanese invade, the Philippine Army is up to 120,000 men in 12 divisions. So the first division was, of course, the regular Army division. It was only about 60% strength, maybe not even that. The second division was nothing but constables whose job was to round up people who they thought would be partial to the Japanese sympathizers, and of course throw them into jail. You had 10 Philippine Reserve Army divisions that each had about 6,500 people in each division, and then you had a bunch of other smaller units, artillery units, a little bit Air Force units, and the Philippine Offshore Patrol. So about 120,000 people in all. The Philippines division had 11,000 people in it. It had 3 infantry regiments. 2 of these were made up of Philippine Scouts, and one of these was an active duty regular Army regiment, the 31st. You have the 26th Scouts, which was the Philippine Scouts Cavalry Regiment. You had the 4th Marine Regiment, which had just been evacuated from China. Had about 1,100 men in it, so it was about 60% strength. There were about 277 aircraft in the Philippines that the Army Air Force and the Philippines Air Force could use. Maybe majority of the modern ones were the 35 B-17s and probably a little bit over 70 P-40s. All the rest were antiquated aircraft. There were 108 tanks and 2 tank battalions, the 192nd Tank Battalion and the 194th Tank Battalion, which were 2 National Guard tank battalions that were been brought to the Philippines just before the start of the war. You have all the harbor defense units in Manila Bay, and you have the Philippine Army Philippine Army Field Artillery Brigade with 155 millimeter guns and self-propelled guns 75s. We'll talk about those a little bit later. The Japanese on their side had 130,000 troops of all sorts in 2 divisions and a separate brigade. They had 541 modern aircraft. They had 90 tanks and 2 regiments. When I say regiments, the Japanese tend to refer to separate battalions as regiments. So if you want to call them regiments or battalions, that's up to you. 3 separate engineer regiments / battalions and 3 separate field artillery regiments. A 155, 105, and 75 millimeter regiment each. They also had 2 special naval landing forces, the first Cure and second Cure. So everything looks equal here on paper, but due to the lack of training for the 120,000 Philippine Army soldiers, it wasn't very equal at all. Plus, the Japanese overwhelming superiority in aircraft would be decisive. Talking about that superiority in aircraft, Japanese, of course, conducted 2 huge raids, air raids. First was on December 8th. MacArthur was told to make sure his Air Force was not destroyed on the ground, and that's exactly what happened. In the early morning, December 8th, his P-40s and B-17s took off. They started running low on fuel about 10 o'clock. They all came in. The airmen went to go have lunch. at their local dining facilities. The Japanese Air Force was supposed to have attacked that morning. It couldn't get off the ground due to heavy fog. Therefore, it didn't take off until late from Taiwan. They called Formosa back then. And they got there above Clark Field and Iba Field just around lunchtime, just as all the members of the air crew were having lunch. And they destroyed majority 12 B-17s and 40 P-40s on the ground. 2 days later, the Japanese attacked Del Carmen Field, just south of Clark Field, and Nichols Field by the Philippines, and knocked out the P-40s there. So the remaining P-40s, less than 20 of them, were combined into one squadron, and some of the P-40s were sent down to Bataan, and some of them were sent as far south as Cebu, and some of them were even sent as far south as the Mindanao. So that's where the remaining 20 B-17s were at, was down in Mindanao, and that's where they would remain. So the Japanese had won the air war in 2 attacks. Not very good start for the United States Army Air Corps. So, Japanese attacked, of course, the remaining United States naval facilities, all the cruisers, the 3 cruisers that had been operating in the Philippines, and all the destroyers, and the oiler had been sent south to the Dutch East Indies to help protect the oil down there prior to this conflict starting. What was left was 27 submarines. The 27 submarines lost all of the torpedoes when the Japanese attacked the Cavite Naval Yard on the 10th. You can see a nice, that's the Naval Yard blowing up from all of the torpedoes exploding. And really, after this, shortly after this, all the submarines are sent to Australia because they have no torpedoes. And the only ships left were a few torpedo boats and auxiliary ships. Auxiliary ships included not only the torpedo boats, but 4 minesweepers and 3 gunboats. The gunboats had been operating in China, and they had made the journey over from China just a few weeks before, but for some reason they did not think that they could make them or the minesweepers could make it as far south to Australia. Not sure why. In addition, there was the famous USS Canopus, which was a support ship for the submarines, which they did not think could make it all the way to the Dutch East Indies or to the Australia without getting destroyed. And of course, when the Navy left, they left 800 sailors at their naval bases who were there performing mostly administrative and maintenance tasks. Not very nice of them. So I call this slide MacArthur alone. Was he really alone? Not really. So what he had on hand was, of course, this great picture of this M3 tank, M3 light tank with this little 37mm gun. He had, of course, his 108 light tanks under Colonel Weaver. So talk about these guys for a little bit. These were 6 National Guard tank companies that in 1941 were hastily arranged into 2 tank battalions and would be the only U.S. tankers in this campaign. And this was a huge, huge gamble by General Marshall sending these 6 tank companies to the Philippines, because he basically left 3 entire National Guard divisions without any tank support in case for when they have to start up when they'd have to mobilize. They'd have to mobilize divisions from scratch when it came to tank support. So uh, they had to basically strip those 6 divisions of all their tankers. Colonel Weaver, of course, was active duty, and everybody else was National Guardsmen. You have the 200th AA Regiment with their 3-inch guns. It had 1,800 personnel. 900 personnel were sent to another field artillery regiment, which was stood up from equipment that was on hand in the Philippines. So they basically got two field artillery regiments out of one. These self-propelled guns down here, once again, Marshall took a huge gamble. We only had a few hundred of these 75 millimeter guns on hand during the war, and he sent 50 of them on these self-propelled half-tracks as anti-tank guns. Of course, nobody thought to send any anti-tank ammunition to the Philippines, so what they ended up using them was just as self-propelled guns to support the Philippine Army divisions. MacArthur, prior to the war starting, had asked for an amazing amount of equipment, and very little of it, actually none of it, which he had asked for the Philippine Army, had arrived. All these other equipment, the AA guns, self-propelled guns, and of course the tanks, were to support the Philippines division. A great book on the subject of the tankers fighting in the Philippines is, of course, Thunder on Bataan. A lot of great insight. What did he really need? What did MacArthur really need? He needed some way to synchronize this fight. In November, he stripped the Philippines Department, the Philippines Division, and any other units he had in the Philippines of officers to go serve with the Philippine Army. So he basically had very small, limited staffs at anything higher than a regimental level. So he had no way to synchronize this fight that was going to happen here in the Philippines. He did ask for a corps level tactical headquarters, but he never received it. He really needed a support brigade, and he needed at least a signal regiment. He did not ask for and he did not receive this, so there was no way he could synchronize supplies and synchronize any movements that were going on because of the lack of communication. So, a little bit about why the Philippines were so important. Here on the on Corregidor was the SIGINT detachment for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy. In 1930, SIGINT, Signal Intelligence, was established. In 1931, MacArthur had tunnels built in the Philippines at Malinta Hill on Corregidor to start, in case the Japanese ever, it was good forethought on his side, if the Japanese ever attacked, basically to be used as anti-aircraft holding areas where people go, bunkers where people could be safe from anti-aircraft, safe from being bombed by Japanese aircraft. These would later be used by the SIGINT people during the war. In 1935, the U.S. Army breaks the red cipher that was used by the Japanese government. And in 1937 to 1940, They also break their purple code, uh, which allows us to pretty much with these two ciphers allows us to read the Japanese diplomatic mail going on, which was great for us because the Japanese, being chatty Cathys, uh, like to keep everybody informed of what's going on, so we could really read all the diplomatic stuff going on in the Japanese sphere of influence. In 1941, a purple machine was sent to the Philippines, and it was, of course, stationed at Corregidor. 1941, U.S. Army is 99.9% sure that there are spies in the U.S. government which are sharing the intelligence being gathered from these encrypto machines, and they stopped sharing. April and May, the U.S. Army stops sharing any information with the U.S. government from these crypto attachments. So that's really why Corregidor was so important. It ended up being a huge intelligence failure because we didn't realize the Japanese were going to change their crypto codes twice in November and December of 1941. But we had a good idea what they were doing prior to that. So, March 7th, in Corregidor, they figure out that AF, the code word AF, stands for Midway. So, if you've ever watched anything on the Battle of Midway, it was not the cipher guys there on Hawaii that broke the code that AF was Midway. It was actually the personnel on Corregidor who did it. And April 8th, 1942, all the cryptologists and SIGINT people are evacuated from the Philippines, and they are sent to Australia. So, in the northern half of Luzon will be where the North Luzon force fights. The Japanese invade Ligayan. This is a very quick overview. Invade here at Ligayan Gulf. Well, first they seize Bataan Island, not the Bataan, but Bataan Island, a smaller island just north of Luzon, where they establish an airfield. They have landings on North Luzon, way to the north, the very tip of it. North Luzon, what they use to acquire some more airfields. 22 December, they invade here in the Ligayan Gulf. For some reason, the Navy or the Army, even though they knew that the Japanese were heading for Ligayan Gulf, they were mined the Gulf. And there was parts of 3 divisions, the 21st, the 11th, and the 71st. That were up on surrounding the Gulf. And then to the south here was the 31st. The Japanese start the invasion. The 35th Division. Here in the south is sent down to Bataan, and the 4 Philippine divisions that will fight up there are the 11th, the 21st, 71st, and 91st. So 2 of the North Luzon Force divisions and the 2 reserve divisions. So from east to west over here, you will have the 21st, the 11th, and the 71st and 91st. So on the 22nd, when the Japanese invade, 2 regiments of the 11th Division are on the north shore here, northeast shore, here at the Lagayan Gulf, and them and the 71st Regiment, just a little bit farther south, are attacked when the Japanese come ashore. Because of their poor armaments, they are not able to hold out for very long. Part of the 71st Regiment goes down the Gulf and heads back to where its headquarters were. The 12th and 13th Regiments and the remainder of the 71st Regiment all head for Bagaggio, which is also known as the northern capital or the summer capital of the Philippines, and from there they have a long, arduous journey south, where they could eventually link up with the regiments. Of the roughly 1,500 men in each regiment, at the start of the campaign, only about 500 of the men actually make it back to their parent divisions. Sea Troop 26 Cav gets cut off. They head inland, where they start up. They never attempt to get back with the rest of their division or cavalry regiment, and they start a guerrilla warfare against the Japanese in the north. So even right at the start of the war, the Japanese was having problems with guerrilla warfare and insurgency going on in their midst. So, same time all of this is going on. Prior to this, actually, I should say, the engineers for the North Luzon campaign had set up blasting teams using professional wildcat miners who were either native Filipinos or American blasters who had worked in the mines in the Philippines, and they had started blowing up all the bridges north of Lagayan Gulf. And then as the Japanese worked their way south, they were blowing up all the bridges in front of the Japanese as they moved south. I don't want to have to go back and explain this for everything single thing, but as you came to each town, the local DPW or city engineer was responsible for blowing up their own bridges in their towns to keep the Japanese from going across. Railroads were, of course, in charge of blowing up their own railroads, and they took an entire Philippine Army engineer battalion, the 91st, which also assisted in blowing up secondary bridges. So, during the big fight, going up here between 12th, 13th, and 71st Regiments, the 26th Cavalry Regiment engages the Japanese as they move south, and along with the 72nd Infantry Regiment, and General Wainwright, who is in charge of the who was in charge of this force, the North Luzon force, asked for a battalion of tanks. He gets a platoon of tanks under a fellow named Brian Morin from the 192nd Tank Battalion, and he drives his tanks up the coast road, runs right without any support, and here by the Mortis has the first tank-on-tank engagement. His tank is hit repeatedly by Japanese anti-tank guns. He moves his tank back with his platoon a little bit, try to get some of his machine guns unjammed. While that's going on, his other 4 tanks are engaged in the Japanese. They see him withdraw, so they start to withdraw. They move past him. A Japanese tank, medium tank with a 57 millimeter main gun, attacks his, cannot puncture his tank with his tank, so he rams him, knocks the track off his tank, Slightly after that, his tank is finally pierced by a Japanese anti-tank round, and him and his crew become the first U.S. prisoners of war uh, of the Japanese. So, not a good start for him, but wasn't entirely his fault. He should have had artillery and infantry support when he attacked, but he didn't. So here in Rosario, there's another large battle that goes on, and the 26th Cav loses 150 troopers when the Japanese attack. If you had seen that picture earlier, let me just go back here. So, right after this picture was taken, these tankers move out later on that evening, and as soon as they move out, the Japanese launch an attack with their own tanks. This is later in the evening, and the 26th Cav thinks that those are additional U.S. tanks that are coming. They're not. They're Japanese tanks. And it was a huge fight, and the cavalry, having just horses and rifles, comes out on the thin edge of that. So, that takes us to the night of the 22nd. The morning of the 23rd, down here by Sasson, the 72nd Infantry is attacked. That's, of course, the 2nd Regiment of the 71st Infantry Division. They actually have some field artillery. They're able to hold out for 2 hours, but they're eventually pushed out by tanks. Japanese continue to move south, where they run into the 91st Infantry Regiment, which is the 1st Infantry Regiment of the Philippine Infantry Division, and they are routed pretty quickly. So that's on the 21st. On the 26th, there's another battle. A small town called Bino Lonan, 26th Cav, and the 2 infantry regiments, and some tanks from the 192nd hold off against the Japanese for about 2 hours, in which case they're forced to retreat. So, on the evening of the 24th going into the 25th, of course, Christmas, yay! MacArthur says War Plan Orange in effect, which means that the U.S. forces will work their way south and head for the Bataan Peninsula. So the lesson learned from this is infantry cannot operate without tanks. Tanks cannot operate without infantry. Infantry and tanks cannot operate without field artillery. Cavalry cannot operate against tanks or infantry without field artillery. So, big lesson learned here is, of course, combined arms warfare matters. So, continue now. War Plan Orange is in effect. So, this is the D1 line. It is formed along from left to right on the D1 line. You have the 21st Division, which pulls back to here along these two main routes. You have the remainder of the 11th Infantry Division with basically one regiment plus, and then the remainders of the 91st and the 71st Infantry Divisions are all formed up along the D1 line. And that's on the 24th and 25th. On the 26th, they moved down to the D2 line, all three divisions. Moved down to the D2 line, blowing all the bridges. Once again, you have the 21st, the 11th, the 71st, and the 91st. The Japanese are going to keep pressure on all these divisions, but their main attack is going to be on the Philippine Army's right side, because all the rivers that flow down this plain are very narrow and shallow at their tops. So they can ford the rivers here. They cannot ford the rivers here or here because there's no bridges. But there's no bridges here, but they can still get across the rivers because they're so shallow and narrow at their starts. So the night of the 26th, they blow all the bridges along the river, the Agno River. Unfortunately, they leave D Company of the 194th Tank Battalion north of the river. They have to abandon all 14 of their tanks wade across the river. So we lose an entire tank company without a shot being fired during this withdrawal. That night, they go back to D3 line. Where they, that night they head back to the D3 line, minus one tank company, and the 5 tanks that they had lost earlier. So here they are on the D3 line. Once again, you have the 21st, 11th, 91st, 92nd, and 71st and 91st divisions. By this time, the right flank is pretty much crumbling because of all the pressure being placed on it, but no additional tanks or troops are moved over there to support it. There are a few strong firefights, but all the when it's time for the Philippine Army to move off this line, they head back to the D4 line. Where on the D4 line, once again, when they go to leave the lines after a short fight, on the night of the th, they lose an additional 5 tanks because once again they're the opposite side of bridges that are blown, and so 5 tanks are lost along with some self-propelled guns. So far we've lost 24 tanks without destroying any Japanese tanks. So the 71st and the 91st divisions go down here to the bridges at Belugia, and these bridges have to be held because the South Luzon force is retreating south of them, and they have to get past those bridges without the Japanese taking them. So on 28th December, and then the other two divisions, the 21st and 11th, of course, form their line, and the Japanese keep on pressuring them, but they have to wait until all the forces gets past them and start heading into to Bataan. So on the 28th, there is another big tank fight down here around Rosario and the bridges. The Japanese attack with their medium tanks, which has a 57 millimeter low velocity gun, against an entire U.S. tank company. The Japanese claim that they only lose one tank, and the Americans claim that the Japanese lose 8 tanks. So what happened here? The Japanese attacked. The Japanese attacked through the town. The U.S. Quickly knocked out one Japanese tank as it's getting close to their position. All the other tanks from the U.S. tank company that attacked used this tank as target practice to make sure that their main guns worked and that they're still accurate. And they destroyed 7 more tanks in the fighting in this town before the Japanese withdrew. So, after the Japanese withdrew, the tankers went back to the bridge, and I'm sorry, that fight was on the 31st. So all the fighting here on the this line was on the 31st. And that was C Company, the 192nd, that was involved in the tank fighting. So after the Americans withdraw, the Japanese go back to reclaim their knocked out tanks. They're able to get several of them running again. The first tank that got knocked out, of course, had multiple, probably 14 or 15 holes in it, so they're never able to get that one running again. So after all the South Luzon force gets past the bridges, on the first, this bridge, all these bridges are blown up. And then the 71st and 91st divisions follow South Luzon force down to Bataan. The 21st and the 11th divisions, after holding their ground as long as they're supposed to, fall in behind, and they start heading into Bataan. So by 2 January, by 2 January, all the units that need to get out of the North and South Luzon force have pretty much made it to where they need to be on the outskirts or into Bataan, where they're going to hold out for as long as they can. Okay, so on the east coast of Luzon, the Japanese attack with one division and part of the Special Naval Landing Force. This happens on 23 December, the day after landings at Lingayen Gulf. They attacked 2 different places. One reconnaissance regiment attacks to the north, and one infantry regiment attacks to the south. The infantry regiment's attack to the south knocks out 1st Battalion of the knocks out 1 battalion of the 53rd Infantry Regiment. Got tracked between them and the Comore Detachment, which was the Special Naval Landing Detachment. And so it's the night of the 23rd into the 24th that they attack. So all this fighting I'm talking about is happening on the 24th. And the Japanese are going to attack down two main routes. One route is being held by the 1st Regiment of the Philippine Army. That's their active regiment. And one regiment's being held by two regiments of the Philippine Army, but these are the reserve divisions, reserve regiments. Overall command is a guy named Parker, but he is quickly relieved and sent back to facilitate what's going to happen in Bataan. And so General Jones, who is the commander of the 51st Infantry Division, takes over. So on the 25th, the two regiments, the regiment here is attacked by the Japanese, and it pulls back. And as it's pulling back, an infantry a platoon of the 192nd Tank Battalion, who's attached to him, is sent forward to try to stop the Japanese. All 5 tanks are quickly knocked out by Japanese anti-tank fire, and the rest of the regiment falls back to Marabao up here. The commander of that regiment, a Major Rumhold, is relieved by Major McKee and his 300 retired Philippine scouts. And at Marabao, they fight with the 1st Regiment of the Philippine Army Division. They fight a 2-hour battle against the Japanese. So once again, it's a wonder why they never brought up the Philippine Scouts, the retired Philippine Scouts, into the Philippines Army, because obviously these well-trained men were able to do a lot of good work here at the next 2 battles. So this regiment fights all the way along the coast road here for the next few days until 29 December against the Japanese Scout Regiment. In the south, here the 2 regiments fight a delaying action against the Japanese. All the way up into the 27th, when they link up with the 1st Infantry Regiment. The engineers all along this route blow up all the bridges in front of the Japanese, so the 2 regiments really don't ever get engaged. The 52nd and 53rd regiments really never get engaged by the Japanese. And on the 27th, finally, the field artillery for the 51st Infantry Regiment arrives, and for the first time, they have their own field artillery supporting them. So the 28th to the 29th, they continue to withdraw. 1 January, they successfully gets past the bridges, and on 1 January, the 52nd and the 1st Infantry Regiment make it into Bataan. Okay, the next series of battles are the delaying actions, holding the roads to, to Bataan to allow the Philippine Army and the Philippine Scouts to get consolidated there. So, on the January 2nd, you have the 21st Infantry Division, in which we left the 11th Infantry Division. They are attacked. They are set up, and they hold throughout the day. And at night, they have to fall back to their secondary lines, and you can see the 11th Infantry Division has a very long route. The Japanese cut the lines behind them by infiltration, so part of the division could not go down the road, so part of the division had to go all the way around and back up around. So I had about 11-mile march just to get to the next positions, which should have been about a 2-mile march. The 21st, once again, had a much easier time of it. Both of these divisions are being supported by the remnants of the 2 tank battalions. Where they continue to hold out. So fighting happens here for the next 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. By the 6th, they can no longer hold out, and they retreat all the way. The 2 divisions, along with the 2 tank battalions, fall back into the Bataan Peninsula. By this time, Parker had set up a screening force made up of the 31st U.S., the 26th Cav, the U.S. 31st Infantry Regiment, the 72nd, and the 71st Division. The 71st Division with the 72nd and the 71st Infantry Regiments. Also on hand were the 23rd, 88th, and 71st Artillery. Fighting here happens throughout the morning of 6 January. Ultimately, by 01:30 on the 7th, the Japanese forced their way between the 31st Regiment and the 72nd Regiment, and all the regiments are forced to withdraw back into Japan. So, by the early morning of the 7th of January, no U.S. forces remain north of Bataan, and they're going to go into the final siege phase of the campaign. So, of the 26,000 men in the North Luzon force, only about 16,000 of them make it into Bataan. So that means they lost about 10,000 men. Most of these men were people who deserted on their way into Bataan when they saw an opportunity. It's not really their fault that they're so poorly trained, so I don't really blame them too much. From the South Luzon force, the 15,000 men were that force, 14,000 are left. But they saw a lot less combat than the North Luzon force. The Japanese claim that they lost 2,000 men in this campaign. So, the first lines set up by the U.S. forces are the Muban, which is over here, and Abaque lines. So you have the remnants of the North Luzon force are over here, still under Wainwright, and over here are the forces under General Parker, which was the South Luzon forces. And it's not exactly, some units were swapped, but it's pretty much, it is what it is. So, U.S. is able to hold on to these lines against Japanese attacks from 8 to 25 January. So the attacks on the First Corps are ultimately unsuccessful. The First Corps is attacked, and they lose. The Japanese attack, and they attack right down into a ravine where the Philippine Army is able to pin them down, and eventually they are forced to retreat back to where they started from. On the East Coast, the Japanese attack up over the mountain and into the rear of the Filipino Army, aka the Second Corps. So this line really only holds for about 17 days or so before everybody's forced to retreat. At the same time this battle is going on, there's the Battle of the Points. The Japanese send 2 infantry battalions south. They think that they can trap the Americans between the pincer movements of the 2 attacks on the Muban and Abaque line and an attack to the south. What they didn't realize is the remnants of the 71st Infantry Division had been moved to the south here and were waiting for them. So the Japanese lose 2 full battalions between 23 January and 1 February fighting here in the south. They don't gain an inch of land fighting against the remnants of the 71st Infantry Division, and also some tankers and other personnel that were there. So that was known as the Battle of the Points, and didn't get the Japanese anything. So, next is the Orion-Bagak line, which is just north here. And for the first time during the war, the U.S. has an entire line. And the Japanese, once again, attack the line, and they are repulsed here at the Battle of the Pockets. And they are repulsed in the west, which is known as in the east, which is known as the Battle of the Points. This all happened from 27 January to 2 February. So by this time, the Japanese are thoroughly exhausted. They all have malaria. They're basically down to 2 units. The 16th Infantry Division and the 65th Infantry Regiment. And the 65th Infantry Regiment was an independent infantry brigade. Was an independent brigade. It was supposed to have been just for policing in the Philippines, but is forced into a combat role. The 48th Division was removed by this time and sent south down to the Dutch East Indies to help in that fight down there. So after the 27th after the 2nd of February, the Japanese have to regroup, and they move back almost completely out of Bataan. So let's talk about what's going on here for the U.S. Starting at this time, the Japanese had malaria and weren't doing very well. The U.S. had malaria. There was a major medical emergency going on in Bataan. There was no major evacuations of the wounded troopers. So down here in the south, where uh, Marivelas, where our medical facilities were, the uh, the casualties are starting to pile up from all these weeks of fighting. There's no incoming food. The supply had been totally bungled going into Bataan, and much of the food was either bombed or was just left north of Bataan. By the end of April, only 25% of the roughly 75,000 troops in Bataan were combat efficient. They had gone from the beginning of the campaign to from half rations to a third rations uh, to April when they're down to quarter rations. What could have helped was D rations. If the U.S. Could have flown some D rations up from Mindanao, if they could have got them somehow in, but they weren't able to. And then this was what helped stem off the beriberi, which is a vitamin deficiency. And the other big thing that was kicking their butt was malaria. They quickly ran out of quinine and atropine to fight off the malaria. So by this time, just about everybody has malaria. And the other big part of the medical emergency was the loss of sulfa drugs, or they didn't have any sulfa drugs after very long. So many of the soldiers were just dying from infections that they received from their wounds. And if you ever watched any of the videos of the soldiers being operated on, there was apparently no anesthesia going on as well, because these soldiers were in serious pain when they're being operated on. So we have a major medical emergency going on, and we also have no food going on. The only thing that saved the day was most of the rice that had been down here on Bataan Peninsula had not been harvested from the prior year's planting, and they were able to during the lull in the battles, the soldiers and the locals were able to harvest the remaining rice, get it ground, so at least they had rice to eat. The 26th Cavalry was forced to eat all their horses and mules. All the soldiers from all the units, all the units would send teams up here to the mountains where they'd kill all the native buffalo, monkeys, snakes, and scavenge for any kind of food that they could. But yeah, people were starving to death pretty quickly here on the. We're getting close to starving to death pretty quickly here on the Bataan Peninsula by April. So the final battle of Bataan happens 3 to 8 April. Homa, who was the commander of the Japanese army in the Philippines, was forced to ask for fresh units. He gets the 4th Infantry Division that shows up. And by April, the defenders on Bataan were so weakened that there was actually a pretty easy fight. The Japanese were expecting a month-long fight. It ended up only being about a 5-day fight. The Japanese attack in the center of the line. They sweep right in a flanking maneuver, cutting off and capturing majority of the Second Corps. They work their way south as quickly as they can, fighting mostly against any units that were remaining from the north. And the was left of the Philippines division. And finally, when they're on the outskirts of the hospitals, General King, he was the commander of Bataan at this time, uh, surrenders. And he does this to spare all the 4,000 plus sick and dying men in 3 different hospitals here in the southern part of Bataan. Parts of some units are able to be able to escape through the Marvellis down to Corregidor, but majority units were not able to. So that is the largest single U.S. Surrender since the Civil War. And poor General King, no wonder he didn't want to write any of his thoughts of the war after the war was over, because he was the poor guy who had to do it. So let's talk about Corregidor. I'm not really going to talk about the Bataan Death March. That has been covered over and over and over again. I'm sure there's multiple videos on about that. You can watch if you want to. But so after this happens for 3 days, General Wainwright, who is now in charge of Corregidor, calls a 3-day halt to any firing from Corregidor on into the mainland, so that U.S. troops who surrendered are able to be to leave. Let's talk a little about the Malinta tunnel complex here before I go into the siege of Corregidor. So, starting in 1930, the intelligence service the signal intelligence service was started in Washington D.C. in the United States. In 1931, like I had said before, the Malinta tunnels were started. We had the red cipher code was decoded, which was one of the Japanese codes, diplomatic codes. In 1937, purple was deciphered by the U.S. Army, which is another one of their codes. Realizing that war was coming pretty quickly in 1939, U.S. Navy transferred $500,000 to the U.S. Army to start work on the tunnels again. Prior to this, only basically this portion of the tunnels were completed. 41, the cipher machines were sent so they could start reading the Japanese codes out of the Philippines. Talked a little bit about the 5 Russian agents. 4 were confirmed later after the war. Actually, in 1991, when the U.S. sent people over to Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they found out that there was actually 4 confirmed Russian agents in the U.S. government who were being supplied by U.S. government officials. So in 1941, as I talked about before, very little data was being sent to the U.S. government from the cipher machines, and what was being sent out to the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy was already raw data. There was no analysis of the data. I talked a little bit about in 1942 that they deciphered that AF was Midway. In late April 1941, General Wavell, who was the head of the British Army in India, said that the information coming out of Corregidor was so important that it must not fall. But little did he know that by 8 April, all Navy and Army codebreakers had been sent out of the islands. So let's talk about the fall of Corregidor. In May, the Japanese send 116 guns to the coast of Bataan to start shelling Corregidor Island. These guns ranged from 75 millimeter to 300 millimeters, which is, of course, 12 inches. And the Japanese said that they sent 1,800,000 pounds of shells. I don't know how many shells that is, but that sounds like a lot of shells. They pound. I mean, my 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 fault. So this is the end of April. This is the middle of April that they do this. Uh, at this time, they could not invade Corregidor because the 4th Infantry Division that they're going to use for the invasion had all come down with malaria, and it took them almost a month to get well. So fast forward to 5 to 6 May. The Japanese picked the 61st Infantry Regiments, 2 infantry battalions, equaling 2,000 men, plus tanks, guarding the coast here of Corregidor was the 4th Marine Regiment, which had been brought up to about 4,000 men and 4 battalions all along the coast. They have been brought up with U.S. Army and Filipino scout troops who had escaped from Bataan, and they had gun emplacements all along the coast with light machine guns, 75 millimeter artillery, and 37 millimeter anti-tank guns to repel the Japanese. The Japanese, on the 5th, wanted to invade up here at Infantry Point, cutting the defenders in half. What they didn't realize is how bad the tides were here, how bad the current was here. And they came in at a time, and all of their barges got swept past the infantry point, and they barely made it to Cavalry Point. And the 2 guns here, a 75 millimeter and a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, opened fire on them. And them, along with some machine gun sections, managed to kill 1,200. I'll say it again, 1,200 out of the 2,000 Japanese man force that was sent to invade them. The 800 men eventually got ashore, split the island in half, and began moving up the island. The Japanese on Bataan were shelling this whole entire area, so it was very hard for the Marine and Army personnel to set up any defensive lines. So the fighting continues all through the 6th, all through the 5th, and on the 6th, the Japanese are able to get 3 tanks ashore, force their way through the defending lines. And by the way, there's not 4,000 U.S. troops in this area. There might have been 1,000 U.S. troops because they had the whole entire coast, or the whole entire island to defend. So it wasn't like it was an overwhelming amount. Japanese are able to get 3 tanks ashore. All the U.S. anti-tank guns, of course, are facing out to sea as part of the island defenses. They don't have any left. The Japanese tanks and infantry are able to work their way right up to the entrance to the Malinta Tunnel, and General Wainwright, who was in charge at that time, was forced to surrender. All 15,000 remaining troops on the island. So, technically, to the Japanese, it was not a surrender. They were held as captives until all of the Philippines had surrendered. So at this time, the Japanese only had troops on really 2 portions of the Philippines. That was the Mindanao in the far south, which I am not going to cover, and Luzon and Corregidor. That was the only portions the Japanese held. So Wainwright was forced to send some of his officers to all the other islands and tell everybody else to lay down their arms and surrender to the Japanese. So this took a little while. So he is held captive for a few weeks. Actually, him and his men are held captives for a few weeks, and then later on, of course, they're sent off to Japanese POW camps. So, the 6th of May is the end of the campaign, sort of. The fighting never, ever stops until after 1945, after the U.S. Comes back under MacArthur in 1944. By the time the Corregidor falls, all of North Luzon is inflamed in an insurgency. Most of the soldiers on the other islands never surrendered. They start guerrilla campaigns. The Japanese tie down tens of thousands of troops, I believe up to 250,000 troops, by the time the Americans come back in 1944, just trying to hold down the islands. So was it worth it? Was all this fighting and dying worth it? I would say no, up until I found out that they broke the Japanese diplomatic code, and this led to the Navy finding out that AF meant Midway. Of course, we had the large, huge naval battle at Midway, which was shortly after the fall of this in June 1942. So, yeah, I guess after all, it was worth it. 43% of the U.S. men who go into captivity die at the hands of the Japanese, either through malnutrition, abuse, general neglect, which is terrible. And then of the men who survived the Japanese POW camps, they lived on an average 15 years less than men who had never been prisoners of war due to their harsh treatment. So these guys really, really deserve our respect. So here's a poem I downloaded about the men fighting on Bataan and Corregidor, and this is what I'll sign off with. I see no gleam of victory alluring, no chance of splendid booty or of gain. If I endure, I must go on enduring, and my reward for bearing pain is pain. Yet though the thrill, the zest, the hope are gone, something within me keeps me fighting on. And I will leave you with that trench poem from either Corregidor or from Bataan. All right, everybody have a great day. Okay, bye-bye.